Green Slade Audio presents Murder on the Dance Floor by Stephen Ford. Read by the author. Prologue. A dance academy run by a cheating husband, his ex-mistress and her husband. A wife aware of her husband's infidelity, and two jealous lovers out for revenge. When one of them is found dead. Was it an accident or murder? This book is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places and incidents are either a product of the author's imagination, or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual people, living or dead, events or locales, is entirely coincidental.
Chapter 1. The elderly couple danced somewhat stiffly in what could loosely be described as a waltz to the André Rieu recording of the Blue Danube Waltz. When the music finished, the couple walked across the empty dance floor to their one-man audience. "Hey, what did you think of that, Craig?" the old man asked expectantly. Their one-man audience was dance instructor Craig Goodman. Craig was 42 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall and slightly built. In an attempt to hide his thinning hair, he had taken advantage of the modern trend and had shaved his head completely. He maintained stubble on his face to give himself that unshaved look. His smile revealed a set of pure white even teeth. Many people believed that he had had dental treatment, but in fact they were natural. He looked at the old man over the top of his spectacles with his piercing blue eyes and said, "Well, Walter, you did one thing right, that's for sure." "What was that, Craig?" came the eager reply. "Coming to me for dance lessons, of course." The old man did not know whether Craig was serious or joking. He studied Craig's face, but could see no trace of humour in those cold blue eyes, and retorted, "Mabel and I have been dancing together for over 29 years. Craig had turned his attention to the CD player, and with his back towards them said, "Well, maybe you should ask yourselves why I have only been dancing for 10 years, and yet I am your instructor." "What a bloody cheek! You mean you were our instructor? I didn't come here to be insulted," the old man said angrily. "Is that right? Where do you usually go, then?" Craig answered sarcastically. Taken aback, the old man turned to make a comment, paused, thought better of it, and said, "Come on, Mabel, we don't have to put up with this. There are plenty of other dance schools out there." And arm in arm they left the building. Dorothy Dixon was slightly older than Craig, although she did not look it. Her long blonde hair and trim figure belied her age, and she was still a very attractive woman. They had met 10 years earlier at dance school. She had been Craig's dance instructor from the beginning, and their relationship quickly developed into an affair, despite the fact that she was already married to Ken. She ended it when she found Craig in bed with one of her pupils. After Craig qualified as a dance instructor, the pair decided to open their own dance school, and she pretended she no longer carried a torch for Craig. Dorothy had been sat in the office enjoying André Rieu's music, and became curious when the music stopped. She entered the dance studio and was surprised to find Craig alone. "Where's Walter and Mabel?" she asked. Craig was still fiddling with the CD player, and without turning round said, "Gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean they're not here. They've gone. But they have 45 minutes of their lesson left. Why did they finish early?" "For Christ's sake, look, Dot. They have been coming here for years. They think they're Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, but they are crap, and I told them so. They may well be crap dancers, but they come every week, and their lesson fees help pay the bills here. How many more pupils will you lose this school? Just because you can't screw them doesn't mean to say you have to be rude." Without waiting for an answer, she stormed back to her office. Beverly Goodman gazed out of her lounge window and thought about her life with Craig. They had been married for just over 2 years. She was the same age as Craig, and they had married just 6 weeks after meeting. She had 2 sons by a previous marriage that had ended after her first husband's affair. In her younger years she was very attractive, but life had not been kind to her. Since her marriage to Craig she had put on weight. She wore her hair short and bleached it blonde. She did not look the kind of woman that would grace a dance floor, never mind a dance instructor's wife. She worked part-time for a local newspaper dealing with classified ads. She was fed up with it, but it helped pay the bills. Beverly was extremely jealous of Craig's partner Dorothy and was sure that there was more than just a professional relationship between her and Craig. For reasons best known to himself, this was a fire that Craig loved to fuel, and the two of them had many rows about it. Her friends and family did not like Craig. They said he was rude and arrogant and could not understand why the couple had married so quickly, and she was beginning to think they were right. Her husband was very secretive, and she had caught him out in a number of lies. She wondered why his mobile phone was always set on silent, and she very often found that he had not gone where he said he was going, despite being absent from home. Truth be told, Beverly was near to breaking point. The sound of a telephone ringing snapped her out of her daydream. It was a mobile phone, but not hers. It was not a ringtone either, but the sound of a mobile phone vibrating on a hard surface. Frantically, she hunted around the room and found the phone on the laminated wooden floor next to the settee. It stopped ringing as she bent to pick it up, and she realized it was Craig's phone. The display was still illuminated, and it read, "Missed call, Ken Mobile." As she stared at the display on the phone, it vibrated again, and the display this time read, "Message." She hesitated for a moment, pondering whether to try to read the message. She convinced herself with the thought that the phone was probably locked and swiped her finger across the display. Surprisingly, the phone was not locked, and with a shaking hand she opened the message. It was from Ken, Dorothy's husband, and a chill crept down her spine as she read the message. It read, "Where the hell are you, Craig? Dot left home ages ago and is not answering her phone. You should have been here some time ago. There are pupils here and no instructors. Call me back." She read the message over and over again. Craig had left her 3 hours earlier, saying he was going to the studio. What was going on, she asked herself, trying not to jump to the obvious conclusion. After staring at the phone for about 5 minutes, she decided to see what other messages were on it, but she found that they had all been erased. This made her feel even more uneasy. She stood with the phone in her hand for what seemed like ages, and then calmly switched the phone back to standby, put it back on the floor, and waited for Craig to come home. Dorothy Dixon awoke with a hangover. She had been at a party with her husband the night before and was paying the price for the amount of wine she had drunk. She forced herself out of bed and stood under a cold shower for a few minutes, hoping her thumping head would return to normal. It didn't. She skipped her breakfast, kissed her husband, who was making coffee, and said, "See you at the studio later." She felt like walking to the studio, thinking the fresh morning air might clear her head, but time was short, and taking the car was the only option. It was only about a 5-minute drive to the studio, and traffic was light. She glanced in her driving mirror to see a blue flashing light behind her, and slowed her car, moving as close to the pavement as possible to allow it to pass. But it didn't. Instead, the police car flashed its headlights and signalled her to stop. "Oh, God, what now?" she muttered to herself. The policeman got out of his car and stood outside of Dorothy's car and motioned to her to open the window. "Good morning, madam. In a hurry, are we?" he said in an over-polite, sarcastic manner. "Good morning, officer. No, I am in no particular hurry," she replied. "You are not aware of why I've stopped you, then?" he asked. "No," she said, although she knew which way the conversation was heading. "Do you know what the speed limit is for this road?" 40, I think," she lied, knowing full well it was 30. He looked disappointed and shook his head. "It's 30 miles per hour, and I stopped you because your recorded speed was 42 miles per hour. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize I was speeding." The policeman looked unimpressed with her apology and said, "Do you have your driving license with you?" "Yes, it's in my bag," she said. He watched as she leaned across to the front passenger seat and lifted her handbag. They both saw the half-full bottle of brandy at the same time. It had been on the seat under her bag. The brandy was left in the car from last night's party, their host insisting that they take it home for a nightcap before going to bed. Dorothy had forgotten it was there. She looked at the bottle and then at the policeman. He stared dispassionately back at her and said, "Have you been drinking, madam?" "It's not what it looks like," she pleaded. "We went to a party last night and I was taking the bottle home. I forgot it was in the car." "Please switch off your engine and come back to my car," he instructed her. She did as she was told and sat in the back of the police car. The policeman sat in the front of the car and turned in his seat to face her. He then looked her in the eyes and said, "I stopped you, madam, because you were committing the moving traffic offence of driving a motor vehicle at 42 miles per hour on a road where the speed limit is restricted to 30 miles per hour. I now have reason to suspect that you were driving under the influence of alcohol and require you to take a breath test. Are you willing to take a breath test? I must warn you that failing to give a sample of your breath will result in you being arrested." "This is ridiculous," protested Dorothy. "I haven't been drinking. Yes, of course, I'll take your stupid test." The policeman set up his breathalyzer kit and held it up for Dorothy to see. He said, "There are 3 lights on the unit. The green light indicates you have not been drinking. The yellow light indicates that you have been drinking but are under the limit. The red light indicates that you are over the limit. I want you to blow into the tube until I tell you to stop. Do you understand?" "Yes, of course I understand. Get on with it," she snapped. Dorothy put the tube in her mouth and kept blowing and blowing. Just as she thought she couldn't blow any more, the policeman told her to stop. They both stared at the unit for what seemed like ages, but it was only seconds when, to Dorothy's horror, the red light came on. The policeman said, "You have failed the breath test, and I am arresting you on suspicion of driving a motor vehicle whilst under the influence of alcohol. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Caroline Drew yawned and stared at the bedroom ceiling, enjoying the last few moments in bed before she started her day. She was 35 years old and attractive in a common sort of way. Her straight black hair was worn shoulder-length and contrasted well with her dark blue eyes. She stood 5 feet 7 inches and had a good shapely body, which got her many admiring glances from the local pub where she worked as a barmaid. Reluctantly, she got out of bed and walked naked to the bathroom and turned the shower on. Pausing only to admire herself in the full-length mirror, she stretched and then entered the shower cubicle. The hot water felt good as it cascaded over her head and on down the rest of her body. After lathering herself with Mont Paris shower gel and rinsing in cold water, she felt fully awake. Turning off the shower, she stepped from the cubicle and reached for a large white bath towel that was hanging on the towel rail. After wrapping the towel around her, which completely encased her body from her breasts to her ankles, she began drying her hair with another towel when she heard the doorbell ring. Still wearing the towel, she opened the door and smiled at the man who was standing there. "This is a nice surprise," she said. "I wasn't expecting to see you." Without saying a word, he kissed her passionately on the lips, picked her up and kicked the door shut with his foot. As he did so, the huge white bath towel fell to the ground. She lay in his arms like a naked child as he carried her into the bedroom and laid her on the bed. She watched as he began to undress, touching herself in anticipation. "You could at least say good morning," she joked, "but I do love it when you are masterful, Craig." Ken Ken Dixon was not having a good day. At 55 years of age, he was a bit older than Dorothy, but kept himself in good shape. He was a chartered accountant by trade and had been married to Dorothy for 20 years. When Dorothy and Craig started the dance school, he seized the opportunity to go into semi-retirement and manage the school's accounts. Dorothy had left home earlier, saying she would meet him at the studio. He knew there were dance lessons booked and expected Craig to be there too. After making himself a light breakfast, he decided to walk to the studio. Taking a short cut across the common, Ken crossed the road and noticed a police car about half a mile away with its blue light flashing, but thought nothing of it. He approached the studio and was surprised to find a group of people standing outside. As he got closer, one of the crowd noticed him and shouted, "Hey, what's up, Ken? We thought you were all on strike." The crowd behind him laughed, and Ken grimaced as he could now see that there were no lights on in the studio and the doors were locked. "Sorry, everybody. I will open up. Come inside, have a drink, and I will find out what has gone wrong," he said apologetically. They filed in and sat down. Ken put on some music and made them all a drink, praying that this would buy him enough time for either Craig or Dorothy to arrive. It didn't. He went into his office and dialed Craig's mobile number. It rang for a few minutes and then diverted to answer phone. He recalled Craig's number again and typed, "Where the hell are you, Craig? Dot left home ages ago and is not answering her phone. You should have been here some time ago. There are pupils here and no instructors. Call me back." And then he pressed send. Thinking that Craig might be at home, Ken rang his landline number and Beverly answered. "Hi, Bev, it's Ken. Is Craig there?" There was a pause, and then Beverly said, "No." "Are you okay, Bev?" said Ken. "You don't sound right." No, I'm okay," she replied, pulling herself together. "He left here some time ago. He's gone to the studio. He has lessons this morning." Not wishing to worry her, Ken replied, "Okay, thanks. I'll catch him there," and rang off. Then he found Dorothy's number and tried desperately to contact her. Dorothy's car was parked in a police station yard about 2 miles away. Her phone, which was on the front seat of the car, rang and rang, but there was nobody there to answer it. Dorothy. Police Sergeant John Barton was tired. At just 1 year from retirement, he was tired of the job, tired of shift work, tired of running the police station and having to mix with all the low-life characters that were brought in. He glanced at the multi-view CCTV monitor and saw probationary constable Duncan Sorial leading a woman in handcuffs into the charge office. He sighed. Probationary constables annoyed him. Fresh out of training school and keen. They always seemed to make a mountain out of a molehill by doing things exactly by the book. "What have we got here, Duncan?" he asked. "I stopped the prisoner because she was driving a car at 42 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour limit. She had a half-empty bottle of brandy on the front seat of her car. This led me to believe that she had been drinking. I arrested her after she failed a breath test," Duncan replied, almost as though he was still at training school. "Okay, Duncan, I think we can remove the handcuffs now, don't you?" Sergeant Barton disapproved of the routine use of handcuffs. Of course, there were occasions when they were necessary, but at this time of the morning, a middle-aged, apparently respectable woman who had committed a motoring offence? Really? The handcuffs were removed, and rubbing her wrists, Dorothy protested, "This is ridiculous. I have not been drinking. I went to a party last night and was given a bottle of brandy to take home for a nightcap. I forgot it was in the car. It's a great pity that you people don't have something better to do." Unmoved, Sergeant Barton, who had heard it all many times before, said, "You have failed a roadside breath test. This has given my officer the authority to arrest you on suspicion of driving a motor vehicle whilst under the influence of alcohol. After I have recorded your details, I will require you to provide 2 specimens of breath for analysis. This will be taken by means of an approved device. The specimen with the lower portion of alcohol in your breath may be used as evidence, and the other one will be disregarded. I warn you that failure to provide either of these specimens will render you liable to prosecution. Do you agree to provide 2 specimens of breath for analysis?" The magnitude of Dorothy's position was beginning to sink in, and she meekly answered, "Yes." "Thank you," he replied. "What is your name and address?" Craig. Craig lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling and fighting the urge to get up and leave. He had met Caroline 6 months earlier when she had come to the studio for dance lessons. She always came without a partner, which gave him the excuse to dance with her, always holding her closer than was necessary. They had started their affair shortly after their first meeting. Craig knew he was using her for sex, but his male ego convinced him that she was in love with him. In fact, he was right. She had been irresistibly attracted to him from the start. She knew he was married, but could not resist his advances and lived for his often unscheduled visits. Suddenly, Craig sat up in bed and snapped, "What's the time?" Without waiting for an answer, he leapt out of bed and walked naked to his pile of clothes that were laid in a heap on the bedroom floor. Frantically, he searched his pockets, but could not find what he was looking for. "My phone! Where's my bloody phone?" he screamed. Caroline sat up in bed, allowing the bedclothes to drop to her waist, exposing her ample naked breasts. "How should I know?" she answered. Hurriedly, climbing into his clothes, he scowled at her, completely ignoring her nakedness. "I must have left the bloody thing at home," he said, almost as though it were her fault. "Well, it's only 11 o'clock, she said with a smile. "Why don't you come back to bed?" "I had lessons at 10, he snapped. "Why didn't you tell me what the time was?" "I just did," she snapped back. "You didn't say you had to go early." But Craig had not even heard her reply. His mind was racing. What if Beverly found his phone? He was sure he had erased all the messages on it, but was not certain. What if she had read his contacts and found numbers that he couldn't explain? How was he going to explain not turning up at the studio for lessons? He slammed the door behind him without even saying goodbye. Beverly. Beverly stood staring out of her window for almost an hour. The longer she stood gazing at the road in front of her house, the more she convinced herself that Craig and Dorothy were having a torrid love affair. There had been numerous times in the past when neither of them had been available and could not come up with a plausible answer regarding their whereabouts. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. Revenge is a dish best served cold, she told herself. But who should be punished? Craig was her husband, and he was the one who was being unfaithful to her. On the other hand, Dorothy was supposed to be her friend, and was being equally unfaithful to her husband, Ken. A voice inside her head kept saying, "Punish them both, punish them both." But how? Ken. Ken's patience was being tried to the full. He was a stickler for timekeeping, preferring to arrive 5 minutes early rather than 5 minutes late. He felt acutely embarrassed by the present situation and reflected upon how unprofessional the dance school looked. Unknown to Dorothy and Craig, he was aware of their affair, and although he had apparently forgiven them, he had to continually try to convince himself that it was all in the past. Instinctively, he kept a watchful eye on their movements. Too many situations like this arose where neither of them was contactable, and they always seemed to come up with flimsy excuses. He watched Craig make a beeline for attractive female pupils that came to the school, and, although he would not admit it even to himself, he harboured a deep dislike, almost hatred for Craig. Luckily, the group of students that had arrived were a jovial lot. He made them coffee and put on some music so that they could dance amongst themselves, and wondered how long it would be before Craig or Dorothy showed up. Dorothy. After recording her details, Sergeant Barton led Dorothy into a small room behind the front desk. In the corner of the room stood a cream-coloured machine, which looked like a telex or teleprinter. Sergeant Barton picked up a tube that was hanging from the side of the machine, opened a drawer, took out a box of unused mouthpieces and inserted one into the tube. Dorothy began to shake uncontrollably as the sergeant asked, "Have you, in the last 20 minutes, consumed any alcohol?" "No." "Used any mouthwash?" "No." "Used any mouth spray?" There was silence. "I need an answer. Have you in the last 20 minutes used any mouth spray?" "No," Dorothy croaked. "Used any medication?" "No." "Eaten anything?" "No." "Inhaled anything?" "No." "Taken anything?" "No." "Brought anything up from your stomach?" "No." "Very well, then. I now require you to give 2 samples of breath by blowing into the tube." He placed a tube into her shaking hand. "Once you start blowing, I want you to continue until I tell you to stop. Is that clear?" "Yes." "Start when you are ready." Nervously, Dorothy's shaking hand placed the tube between her lips, and she started to blow. In reality, it was less than a minute, but to her it seemed like an eternity before she was told to stop. Paper began to spew from the machine. Sergeant Barton tore the paper report from the roll, read it, and without comment said, "OK, now same again, please." Another eternity passed as Dorothy blew into the machine, but at last she was told to stop. Once again the machine spewed its report, and once again Sergeant Barton removed it from the machine and read it. Dorothy felt very hot, and the room began to spin as he turned to her and said, "Dorothy Dixon, I would remind you that you are still under caution. You have supplied 2 samples of breath. The maximum legal prescribed limit is 35 micrograms of alcohol in 100 milliliters of breath. Your first sample contained 37 micrograms, and your second sample contained 34 micrograms. As explained, we disregard the higher reading, and so there will be no further action taken regarding driving under the influence of alcohol. 34 micrograms is below the prescribed legal limit. However, you will be reported for the original offence of exceeding the speed limit." This was too much for Dorothy, and she passed out. Dawn. Dawn Carney was an attractive 22-year-old. Her 36-24-36 figure and ridiculously long legs meant that she was not short of male company. She usually wore her shoulder-length red hair clipped back, which accentuated her high cheekbones and emerald green eyes. Until recently she had been a dancer on a cruise ship, and had married one of the ship's officers following a whirlwind romance. After her marriage she had continued working for the cruise line, but within a short period of time they were assigned to different ships. Months apart took its toll, and because of her husband's insane jealousy and infidelity, they were still married, but were now living apart. She had been thinking of getting back into dancing for some time, mainly to improve her social life with like-minded people. After reading a newspaper article on Craig's dance school, in which he had expressed an interest in competition dancing, the thought of being involved in that appealed to her. A friend, who was already one of Craig's pupils, suggested she give the school a try, and so she had come along full of expectation. After arriving to find the dance studio locked up, waiting outside for almost half an hour, and then finding there were no instructors present, she was beginning to think she had made a mistake. Still, the other pupils seemed a jovial lot, and she was having a laugh. Craig. Fortunately for Craig, Caroline's flat was only about 5 miles from the dance studio, and he drove like a lunatic to get there, his mind racing, trying to think of an excuse. When he was almost there, he stopped his car, opened the bonnet and rubbed his hands over the engine, smearing them with oil and dirt. Then he locked the car up and ran as fast as he could to the studio. He opened the studio door, and with his arms outstretched in order to show everyone his oil-stained hands, he turned on the charm and said breathlessly, "Sorry, everyone. Damn car broke down again, and I left the phone at home." Ken, watching from the back of the studio, immediately thought, "Lying bastard," but said nothing. I will just clean up, and then we can make a start," he continued. And then he saw Dawn. Their eyes met, and there was an immediate attraction. It was something that cannot be put into words, but anyone who has experienced it will know what the two of them were feeling, a kind of magnetic chemistry that rarely happens. Some people never experience it at all. He walked up to her and, ignoring everyone else, said, "Hello, do we have a new pupil? I am Craig." She smiled. "I am Dawn," she replied, and offered her hand. Without taking his eyes from hers, he said, "Of course you are," and instinctively raised his hand to shake hers. Then, remembering their oily state, laughed and said, "I must clean up. We will have a chat later and get you enrolled." "Yes, I'd like that." She watched him turn and admired his tight backside as he walked away towards the bathroom. Beverly. The more Beverly thought about Craig's antics, the more hurt and angrier she felt. When they first met, he had very little. In fact, he was up to his eyes in debt. He had managed to get a mortgage on a rundown property with the intentions of renovating it himself. He had started the work and then run out of money, and the inside of the house was like a tip. On the other hand, she was quite well set up. Her husband had signed their house over to her following their divorce, and she had a substantial sum of money invested. She fell for Craig's charming manner, and after a whirlwind romance, they married, and she sold her property. Taking the profits from the sale of her house, she settled his debts and paid for the renovation work to be completed on his house, and they lived there together. That was 2 years earlier. They were ideally happy for the first 6 months, but then she became aware that he was a compulsive liar. It started with little things, telling stupid tales about things he had done in his past that was obviously untrue. Then he became unreliable and never seemed to be where he said he was. She had her suspicions about Craig and Dorothy, and now today seemed to confirm her fears. She picked up the phone and rang the studio. Ken answered. "Is Craig there, Ken? It's Beverly." "Hello, Bev. He's conducting a lesson at the moment. I shouldn't disturb him unless it's urgent. The pupils have been waiting for him to arrive for some time. Okay, nothing important. What time did Craig arrive then? About half an hour ago. His car broke down. Shall I tell him you called? No, don't bother him, it's not important. Couldn't Dorothy have taken the lesson? No, she's not arrived yet either. A cold chill ran down her back as she slammed the phone down in anger. Their house was about a 15-minute walk away from the studio. Craig had left the house some 4 hours ago. If he had broken down, he could have walked to the studio and still have been in time for his lesson. And where was Dorothy? Dorothy came around to find 2 policemen standing over her, one of them holding a glass of water. It was clear neither of them really knew what to do. Are you okay, Mrs. Dixon? One of them asked. Yes, I don't know what came over me, she said. I suppose it was the shock. I really don't drink and drive, you know. Now let's not go through that again, said Sergeant Barton, relieved that this woman was apparently all right. The last thing he wanted at this stage in his career was for someone to die in his custody. We have established that you were not driving whilst drunk, and that charge is not being pursued. Do you want us to call somebody to collect you? You are free to go. The last thing Dorothy wanted was to involve her husband Ken. He was a stickler for the law and disapproved strongly of drunks and speeding motorists. No, far better to keep this to herself. Her property was returned to her, and relieved, she opened her car door, climbed in, and sat in the police station yard crying. After about 10 minutes she pulled herself together and looked at her watch. This jolted her back into the real world, and she realized she should have been at the studio to give a dance lesson with Craig some time ago. 5 minutes later she pulled into the dance studio car park and noticed straight away that Craig's car was not there. When she opened the studio doors, the rhythmic sound of salsa music hit her. The assembled pupils and her husband Ken were standing around the dance floor, their eyes transfixed on the couple in the middle of the floor. She immediately recognized the male dancer as Craig. He was dancing with a very attractive red-haired woman whom she had not seen before. Dancing was not really the correct term. What Dorothy saw was a couple, fully clothed, simulating sex to music. Since Dorothy was not aware that Craig had arrived late too, and it was obvious to her that his dance partner was not a pupil, she assumed that this red-haired woman was another instructor, brought in to cover for her because of her lateness. As she watched, she was reminded of the way she used to dance with Craig when they were having their affair. She wondered if this attractive young woman could feel Craig's erection as she gyrated her hips against his in the way she had done years ago. Although she would not admit it, feelings of jealousy washed over her as she watched the couple on the dance floor who seemed oblivious to everyone else. The music came to an end, and the other pupils, who would become an audience, applauded. That was when Ken noticed Dorothy and walked over to her. "Where did she come from?" Dorothy asked, gesturing towards Craig's partner. "Never mind her. Where the fuck have you been?" came the reply. Ken very rarely swore, and to use the F word to her in public came as a shock. Before she could answer, he ordered, "My office, now!" and stormed off. Caroline was amazed and hurt by Craig's behaviour. She felt used and abused and wondered why he would treat her like that. She thought back to when they had first met some 6 months earlier. She had been attracted to him from the start, even though quite clearly he was a ladies' man and married. She had just come out of a relationship and was particularly vulnerable, and Craig showered her with compliments and attention. Within a week they became lovers, and Craig was insatiable and satisfied her like no man before him ever had. She became obsessed with him, thinking about him night and day, just living for the next time they met. This morning's visit was typical Craig. He would usually turn up unannounced, and inevitably they would end up in bed. Normally, though, Craig would spend some time with her after their sex session before excusing himself to leave. She felt that today, maybe, Craig had shown his true colours and was simply using her for sex. Well, she was about to show him that wham bam thank you ma'am was not her style. It was high time Craig had a wake-up call. Craig thought about his marriage to Beverly. They had met at a wedding. It was a perfect summer's day in June, and the venue was a country club. He was a friend of the groom, and Beverly was a friend of the bride, and they found themselves seated next to each other at the wedding reception. He had always had an insatiable sexual appetite, and finding Beverly reasonably attractive, he immediately latched onto her as another possible conquest. As they chatted, he turned on the charm and became more and more interested in her when he learned that she not only owned her own house, but had a sizable sum of money invested. He thought this might be just what he needed. He had taken out a mortgage on an almost derelict house and started to renovate it. A second loan and credit cards brought some materials, but work had stopped after he had run out of cash. He was now over his head in debt. He was tired of living in a house whose interior resembled a building site. After the meal, they sat all afternoon drinking and chatting away as though they had known one another for years. Before they realized, it was 8 o'clock and the disco had started. As a dance instructor, he immediately stood out when they got on the dance floor, and Craig used this to his advantage. He showed her a few moves which she was keen to learn and improve her own very basic dance knowledge. Around 11 o'clock, the DJ slowed the tempo down. When he played Elvis Presley's You Were Always on My Mind, Craig declared that this was one of his favourite songs and led her back to the floor. He held her close, and for the first time she kissed him passionately on the lips. Before the record ended, she whispered in his ear, "Let's go to my room." He immediately agreed, thinking, "This will be easier than I thought," and they left the dance floor. Beverly was wearing a long, low-topped summer dress with a scarf draped over her shoulders. As soon as they entered her room, she shrugged the scarf off and slipped the thin straps off of her shoulders, allowing the dress to fall to her ankles. She stepped out of it, standing in front of Craig, wearing only a red half-cut strapless bra and matching skimpy knickers. She walked slowly towards him, and he stepped backwards, falling flat on his back onto the bed. She immediately sat astride him and, after reaching behind her back to undo her bra, began tearing at his clothes. For the 1000th time, Craig replayed the events of that night in his mind. He often joked that the honeymooners, whose wedding they had celebrated, had more sleep that night than he did. For the next 2 or 3 weeks, the pair were inseparable, having sex at every opportunity. Craig was amazed that at last he had found a woman whose sexual appetite matched his. 6 weeks later they were married, but truth be told, the only thing they had in common was sex. Craig remembered the first 6 months of their marriage with very fond memories. Beverly sold her house and moved into his. She paid off his debts and pumped money into his property and got the renovation work finished. He loved his job as a dance instructor, and they were still having sex 3 or 4 times a day. What was there to not like? Hardly noticeable at first, but Beverly slowly began to lose interest in sex. Craig began to notice that it had always seemed to be him who initiated a sexual encounter. Before, she very often seemed to pounce on him as soon as he got home, but slowly that became a thing of the past. She never refused sex, but her participation became less and less, until eventually it was him making love to her rather than the pair of them making love to one another. Eventually she just lay there, allowing him to do whatever he wished. Sometimes she had an orgasm, sometimes she didn't, but Craig soon became bored of her lack of response, and their sex life came to a halt. It was then that Craig began to look elsewhere to satisfy his sexual needs. Beverly rarely went to the dance studio during the day. She had her own part-time job at the newspaper and, together with cleaning and tidying the house, found very little time for anything else. She also stayed away from the studio because although she realized that dancing was Craig's livelihood, she hated to see him close to other women, many of them far more attractive than her. Once or twice a week the dance studio would hold social evenings, and then she would go along to run the bar at the school. But aside from that, she left her husband alone to operate the business with his partner Dorothy. However, today she was angry. Today she was going to the studio to find out what the hell was going on. She decided to walk to the dance studio in order to let her anger subside and clear her head. She had gone in all guns blazing in the past and had been made to look a fool. But not this time. Nobody noticed Beverly arrive at the studio a few seconds behind Dorothy. She joined the other spectators and watched Craig and Dawn's raunchy show that was taking place on the dance floor. She accepted that dancing was his life, but this display, to her, was beyond the pale. They might as well have been having sex in front of a live audience. When the music stopped, Beverly felt embarrassed. To think that her husband would behave like that in front of her friends and his work colleagues with another woman. If he would act like that in public, she shuddered to think what he would do in private. She wanted to rush over and slap his face and make a scene, but somehow she was rooted to the spot. Craig's attractive red-haired dance partner was all over him as they walked hand in hand off the dance floor, enjoying the round of applause their audience was giving them. She saw Ken beginning to walk over towards Dorothy, his face like thunder, and slipped out of the studio unnoticed.